Almost every robot you ever create is going to have to examine data and make a choice about which path it needs to take through the logic. There are several different mechanisms we can use when we need to make choices. There's an if-else activity, there's a decision activity, and there's something called a switch activity. So let's take a look at if-else. I'll start by creating a blank project called if-else. I'll store it in C Development UiPath, and for description, also if-else. I'll collapse my ribbon to give me some more space, and in the activities, I'll type in if. So that's the first mechanism I was talking about. If I type in the beginning of the word decision, you can see that we have this thing called a flow decision. If I type in switch, you see that we have a flowchart flow switch or a control flow switch. We'll cover all of these in this section. The first thing I'll do, however, is to create a sequence, because any robot needs to either have a sequence or a flowchart at the top level. Now that I have a sequence, I will rename it just to remind you that I can. I'll call it tryout if else, and I'll jump over here into my activities search and type in if, and then I'll click and drag my if activity into my sequence. And when I let go, you already get a pretty clear idea of how this is going to work. You can see it's asking for some kind of a VB expression, which will evaluate to true or false. If that expression evaluates to true, we will follow this path. However, if this expression evaluates to false, we will follow this path. And notice, this is telling us we can drop any activity we want here. It's important to understand that you can only drag in one activity in either of these cells. If you want to have multiple activities executed, you'd have to drop in a sequence or a flowchart as a container for multiple activities. Sometimes I find myself dropping in a single activity, and later I decide I need to have multiple activities. So what I do in that case is I click on this activity, I Control X, then I search for a sequence and drag it in, and then inside that sequence I will hit Control V and then add in other activities inside that sequence. But you'll see me do that in future videos. So for now, I'll create a variable inside this sequence scope. So I click on Variables, and I'll type in what to do. I'll call that a Boolean because that's a true or false value, and I'll set the default to true. So I'll click on Variables to hide that window, and now up here I can start typing what to do and hit Tab. So we know that's going to evaluate to true, so when I run my robot, we're going to go through this path of execution. So to prove that, I'll grab a message box, click and drag that in here, open my double quotes, and say it was true. And I'll copy that and paste it into my else statement and say it was false. So now when we run the robot, our sequence has this one if activity, and if this evaluates to true, it'll show this message box, otherwise that message box. Let's run it. Sure enough, we get it was true. Now if I use this assigned activity, and I drag it in front of the if, and I type in what to do and set its value to false, of course when I run the robot, now we're seeing it was false, because the value that I assigned here with my assign activity is overriding the default value of true, and that's causing this to evaluate to false and display this message box. Now, one thing I think is pretty cool about how these UiPath developers built this tool is that all of these activities can be copied and pasted from one into another, and they always adapt and do the right thing. What I mean by that is if I type in flowchart here, and I drag a flowchart into my sequence, now you see that we do an assignment, then we have a flowchart, then this sequence that has my if in it. And I'll use Control mouse wheel to kind of zoom back on this. But you can see that it renders a certain way. I've got my condition and then my two branches, and I didn't have to do anything to cause it to display that way. I'm simply in my main sequence, and that's what it looks like inside the sequence. If I click on that and hit Control X to copy it, and then double click on my flowchart, now you can see we're inside the tryout if-else sequence, and then we're inside a flowchart. And if I click in the middle of this flowchart and hit Control V, you can see that my if activity renders a completely different way. If I click and drag to make that my first node, we're still going to see the same behavior. So I'll run the robot. Notice it says it was false. That's because inside this flowchart, that variable is still in scope because it was declared in the parent sequence. If I double click on my if activity inside the flowchart, you can see that now it renders the way we're used to seeing it. Another thing that's kind of cool, if I delete this message box activity, is that I can nest if activities within other if activities. So you can see I've clicked and dragged, and now I have this if activity, and in the else path, I've got another if activity. So of course, if I set this one to true and add another message box here, I'll call this true from inside the nested if. So when I run the robot this time, this will evaluate to false, send me into this path, then this one will evaluate to true, and cause that message box activity to display. So I'm running the robot, and there you go, true from inside the nested if. So that's a good introduction to the if activity. It's important to remember that you can only drag one activity into either of these paths. And if you want to have multiple activities inside here, for instance, I would just hit Control X, find the sequence, click to drag the sequence in here, and then paste in that original activity. And then I can search for any other activity that I want to and click and drag that in as well. So that's how you put multiple activities inside any given branch of an if activity. Now let's take a quick look at the decision diamond. To do that, I'm going to jump back out here to main and right click to delete this entire activity. Notice we no longer have a variable because all of our scope is gone. So in order to demonstrate the decision diamond, I need to type and search for a flowchart to add into my workflow. So I click and drag my flowchart in, and you can see that gives us our start node. What I'll do to demonstrate this is use an assign activity, and I'll click and I'll drag that on, and I'll zoom in here a little bit, and I'll right click to create a variable, call it what to do, and I'll set the value to true. And I can either right click and make that my start node, or I can drag and drop the arrow from start to my activity. Now I'll search for decision up here, and notice it says flow decision. This is something that can't be used inside of a sequence. And as you know, standard flowcharts that represent a complex process will often have these things called decision diamonds. So of course you can rename this. I'll call it which path to take, and I'll connect the bottom of my assign to this decision. And when I hover over it, you can see that it's got a false path and a true path. The important thing to know about this flow decision is that you must click on it and enter your condition up here in the properties pane. So I'll pull this out to give us a little bit of space and expand that. So of course, just like the if activity, we need to put an expression in here that will evaluate to true or false. You can see that we've got a variable called what to do, and that shows up down here in the variables pane under the flowchart scope. I'm going to change that to a Boolean, and you'll notice when I click on my decision and I click in here for the condition and I start typing what, the IntelliSense shows us that variable, so I can just hit tab and move away. Notice we can change those labels. When you hover over this, it says true and false. If I wanted to, I could change this to yes and no, or whatever text you'd like. Notice now they say yes and no. So I'll grab a message box, and I'll click and drag that into my flowchart. And notice that since we're in a flowchart, we can't just type our message into the message box. We need to double click on it and open up our quotes to start typing. So here I'll type, it was true. And then I'll use my breadcrumbs to go back to my flowchart. I'll rename this to true path. I'll copy and paste that again using Control-C, Control-V. And I'll just reorganize these things a little bit. I'll rename this one to false path, double click to go inside of it, change this string to it was false, use my breadcrumbs to go back out. I could have just as easily used this control down here in the bottom right. And now we're going to connect them up. I will click and drag here from yes to this message box, and I'll click and drag here from no to the input of that message box. So when I run the robot, it's going to make an assignment of true to this variable. Then we'll hit this decision diamond, and if it's true, it'll show this message box. If it's false, it'll show that one. Here we go, let's run. So as expected, we see it was true. And of course, if I change this to false and rerun the robot, now we see it was false. So if I zoom back and create a little space, you can see where using this decision diamond inside of a flowchart, along with other activity blocks, is going to be a great way to represent what the robot does to business people who traditionally understand processes by looking at flowcharts. Again, this decision diamond can only be used inside the context of a flowchart, not a sequence. Continuing on with the topic of script control flow, in this video, we're going to talk about the switch activity. If you don't already understand the concept of switch, be sure to check out my RPA Tech Primer course. But briefly, a switch is the activity you can use when the data point you're evaluating has many possible values, and you need to do something different for one or more of those values. Switch will also give us the opportunity to perform a default action if the data point doesn't match any of your switch branches. Let's take a look at it. As I often do, I'll start with a new blank project. I'll call it switch, copy and paste that into my description, and save in C Development UiPath. I'm double-clicking on Design to collapse the ribbon at the top, and I'll slide this panel over to give myself a little more space. Next, I'll jump in here to my search activities and type the word switch. And that reveals that under System, Activities, Statements, we have two choices. One of them is switch, and you can kind of tell by the icon what it does. It allows us to choose between multiple options. And we also have the flow switch. The main difference between these two things is that the flow switch can only be used in a flowchart, while the normal switch activity is more of a sequence-based mechanism, but you can still drag it into a flowchart if you want to. You cannot drag a flow switch into a sequence. I'll start off with a sequence and a switch to demonstrate the most basic functionality. So I type sequence here and drag a sequence in. I can rename this, make a choice. Then what I'll do is I'll type in input, and I'll click and drag my input as the first activity of my main sequence. The input dialog is exactly what it sounds like. We supply a title here with double quotes. I'll just type action required, and the label is what's going to show inside the input dialog. Here I'll enter type a fruit name. And when I run the robot, you can see that that's just going to ask us to type in a fruit name and click OK. So to capture what we type in, we need to click over here in the Properties pane and right-click to create a new variable. I'll name this the fruit choice and hit return. So now when we type something in, it's going to be stored into that variable, which has a scope of this make a choice activity. So I'll close up my variables tab, and this is where we get to our switch. I type in switch, click and drag my switch into the sequence, and now you can see it's asking us for an expression. And this is simply some kind of text or a value or a variable that represents the data that we're going to use to make our decision about what to do next. The most important thing you need to pay attention to when dragging a new switch on is this type argument here, because that's specifying what type of data is going to be here as our expression. So at present, it's int32, so all I can do is type in some kind of a number here for my expression. If I try to type in 1.5, that's not an integer, and it's going to complain about that. If I try to type in a string, we have the same problem. So it's important to realize that if you want to switch on a string, you've got to jump up here and change this to string, or whatever type of data you have in your expression. In this case, we're giving the user an opportunity to type in the name of a fruit, and then we're going to do something different depending upon which fruit they type in. So we need to copy this variable we created and paste that into our expression. So whatever gets typed in here is going to be in that variable, and then we're going to decide what to do based on what was typed in. The switch activity gives us an opportunity to do something different based on different cases of what might be present within this variable. So to add options, we simply click on Add New Case. And here we type in a value that we might expect to find inside this variable or this expression. Now, given that we're dealing with strings here, you might be tempted to type in double quotes like usual and supply your case value that way. But that's not how these work. Strangely enough, even though we're dealing with strings, you do not use double quotes for your case values. Very important to understand that. Even if I had two words here, we would still not use any kind of quotes for that case value. So each of these cases is simply a new nested sequence inside of the switch activity. So I'll put in one more here, cherry, and click away. So like I said, these are essentially nested sequences. If I click on apple, we're going to drop an activity here that will occur if what I type in matches apple. If I click on peach, you see we have an opportunity to drag an activity here. If I click on cherry, same thing. So what happens if what I typed here doesn't match apple, peach, or cherry? In that case, we're going to execute this default case. So we have an opportunity to drag in another activity here that will occur if my expression doesn't match any of these cases. To keep things simple for this demo, I'm only going to use message boxes as the activity we're going to perform. So I'll click and drag a message box into my default block here, and I'll open double quotes, and I'll type in no match. Notice what happens if I try to drag in a second activity. It will automatically create a sequence around those activities because only one activity is allowed in any one of these blocks. And that activity can be a sequence that contains multiple activities. In this case, I only need one message box. So I'll select and Control X here, right click to delete this one, and then Control V my message box back in. I'm going to Control C on this and click on the apple case and click here in the center and Control V. And here I'll type, you want an apple. And then I'll Control C to copy that and click on the peach case, click in the center and paste. Change this to peach. And finally click on cherry, paste one more time, and type in that you want a cherry. So by accidentally double clicking, I wound up inside the switch statement. So I'm going to click on make a choice up here to get back into the root of my sequence. And like I mentioned, if whatever I type in here doesn't match apple, peach, or cherry, we're going to see the default no match. So let's run it and try. Here I'll simply type in foo and click OK. Notice it says no match. I click OK, run again, click and type in apple, click OK. You want an apple. Should be fairly obvious, but I'll do it one more time. Type in cherry, click OK. So you get the idea. The switch activity allowed us to evaluate an expression and compare that value against multiple cases and do something different for each case. If there's no match, we do whatever's in the default block. So down here in these cases, you may recall that I typed in a literal string of the choice. What we could do instead here is simply delete that, add a plus sign, and then grab this variable, paste it in, and since that variable is a generic value, I need to add .toString. So that just allows us to use the value of whatever was passed in down here in our activity. So I'll demonstrate that one more time by typing apple, click OK, and you can see that it utilized the value of that variable in my message box. Now, just to show you that I can still use this normal switch inside of a flowchart, I'm clicking on Input Dialog and Control clicking on Switch so that both of them are selected, and I'll use Control X and then click on Main in the top left here and right click to delete my sequence. Now I'll type in flowchart and click to drag a flowchart onto the canvas. Control mouse wheel to zoom back a little bit. Click in the center and Control V. Now you can see we've got our input dialog and our switch, and I can hover and click and drag an arrow to connect these things together. Now you can see it's complaining, and the reason why is because when I deleted my main sequence, I lost that variable that I created. But it's easy enough to go back and create that. If I click on my input dialog and come over here to my properties pane, select and Control X to cut, right click and say create variable, and then paste that same name back in. Now down here in the variables tab, we've got our variable back. It's still a generic variable, and the scope now is flowchart, which was very similar to that top level sequence we had in the previous example. The only real difference now is that my switch looks like a block, and the only way we can see what it's doing is by double clicking on it to go inside. Now we can see that our expression is still the fruit choice, and we've got a default case and the 3 cases we had before. If I run the robot, it works exactly the same way inside a flowchart. So just remember that a switch activity allows us to evaluate an expression, which could be any different type of data. Boolean doesn't make much sense because that really only has 2 possibilities, and the whole reason we use a switch is to provide more than 2 cases. But if we had an int32 or a string, or we could even browse for types and use decimal and whatnot, just remember that you have full control over what type of argument is going to go in here. So if I click back on main, let's demonstrate the flow switch. I'll click on this arrow to delete it and move this one aside. Type in switch again over here, and this time click and drag a flow switch. Notice that looks a little bit different than the traditional switch. When I hover over this, you can see that I have these gray ports at the edges of this flow switch. Those are simply options that represent the different cases we're going to create over here in the properties window. So let's make this one do the same thing that our previous switch did. I'm clicking on the flow switch, changing this over to string, and instead of typing the expression here inside the activity, I need to type that same expression here in the properties pane. So I'll type in THE, which brings up my IntelliSense, and double click on the fruit choice. So now we're going to switch on the value of this variable and do some different things. So I'll connect my input dialog to my switch. You'll notice here in the properties window, we don't have any place to supply different case values like we did for the traditional switch. The only way we can create cases is by dragging new options on to the flowchart that will perform after we make a decision. So here I'm going to type in message box again. Actually, let's not do that. Let's just go in here and double click to copy an existing message box. I'll Control C to copy that and go back to our main. And I'll click in the center of my flowchart and Control V to paste. So I can click up here and call this one my default when nothing matches. Double click in there and change this to no match, and then click to go back to the main. Then I'll Control V to paste again, and I'll rename this one Apple. And when I double click inside there, I'll make that string more generic. Notice I won't have to change what the person wants because we're taking advantage of that variable. So I go back to main, Control C to copy this and paste it. We'll make this one the peach, Control C to copy and paste, and change this one to cherry. So again, all of these things could be sequences or flowcharts or any other series of activities you want to accomplish based on something that you evaluated here in this flow switch activity. So you can see that we've got these 12 ports we can hook up. So of course that limits the number of decisions we can make. Whereas you may recall that the traditional switch is pretty much unlimited. We can keep adding new cases as much as we want. So you can see that the only reason we might use a flow switch is when the stakeholders of the robot really want to see a flowchart and be able to visualize the flow that happens, because it is more limiting in what we can do. But then again, 12 possible options isn't too bad. So let's hook it up. I can click on any one of these ports and drag it to my desired activity and let go. And notice that's when the case value shows up. And when I click on that arrow, now over here in the properties pane, I have the ability to rename that and change whether or not it's the default case. The first one you drag on is always going to be the default by default. So I'll hover over the flow switch again, click and drag from here to there. Notice when I click on this one, I can say that my case is now Apple. And I drag to this one. I'll click on this and change that to peach. And notice again, I'm not using double quotes there. Hover and click and drag one more time. Click on that and call it cherry. And now you can see, based on whatever we type into this input, my flow switch is going to evaluate it and then redirect the flow of my robot accordingly. So let's run it and see what happens. It's asking me to type a fruit name. I'll type cherry and click OK. And as we expect, you want a cherry. I'll run it once more. Type in Ferrari. Click OK. Notice it says no match. And that's it. That's how you can use a flow switch instead of our default switch. Before I close out this video, I want to share one more great reason for using a flowchart and a flow switch. This combination makes it much easier to create things like retry loops. And what I mean by that is, let's say that if whatever you type in doesn't match one of these choices, your desire is that the user will be forced to go back and try again at this input dialog. So again, whether this was a sequence or another flowchart that you use to log the fact that there was a mismatch, ultimately what you can do is click on this output port and drag an arrow back up to the input dialog. And now you've completed that circuit. So this time when I run the robot and I type in something that doesn't match, it tells me there was no match and then sends me back into the input dialog. Now, of course, you have to be careful with this so you don't create some kind of an infinite loop. Because right now, if I try to close this, it tells me there's no match. And if I try to close that, it takes me back to the input dialog. So of course, you'd want to have some kind of a variable in the background that limits how many times a mismatch could occur and stops the robot after that threshold is reached. In this case, I can simply type in apple to proceed and end the robot. The most important thing to remember is that regardless of whether you use a normal switch or a flow switch, the first thing you're going to want to do is change this type argument to reflect the type of data value you're going to be evaluating. So hopefully you can see how powerful this is to provide many different paths of execution for your robot based on whatever kind of input data you get from a dialog like this, or reading a text file, or an Excel document, or even something from a database.